And Lord, we do pray this all in his name, in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, turn your Bibles to the book of Esther. A couple books prior to the book of Psalms, the book of Esther, we're in the 3rd chapter of the book of Esther. And as we see this, we recognize here comes that anti-Semitic, that anti-Jew plot, which is being brought forward by a character we're going to be introduced to today in the 3rd chapter. Based on the fact that this entire book is one singular narrative story, a chronology of the things and events that are happening, it's important that we remember where we've been before we take a step forward. As we're looking at this, we have to remember that God is not distant from his creation. God is the God of providence and sovereignty. God is working in our lives as we speak. God is not the God who stands afar off, as many deists would say, looking at creation but not interacting with creation. God is active in his creation. We are not God's reality television show that is for his entertainment. God is active in his creation. He is working to bring about his perfect plan and purposes for his creation. Hear this. Not our perfect plans or purposes. His perfect plans and purposes. And as God is actively working to accomplish his purpose, his providence in our lives, we have to remember how personal this has to be. This is not something he's doing in other people's lives. This is not something he's doing in other times in history. This is not something he's doing in other continents. God's providence is working in your life right now. And you may never see it or be aware of what he's doing or what his purposes are. Just a question as we've been trying to put this before us. I want to continue to keep this in front of us. Have you been watching for God's providence in your life? Have you been observing? Have you been looking? Have you been taking the time to be able to say, God, I see your hand. God, I am aware of the fact that you are working. And the things that you're doing, I don't always understand. Sometimes I look at events in my life and I think, God, what are you doing? But are you watching for this? Are you pointing your children toward this? Are you aware of the fact that he is working? And are you even watching for that? Now, as we recognize the fact that even as we look at many of the events and the things that take place in our life, some of them are extraordinarily painful. Some of them are extraordinarily difficult. Sometimes they feel like they are purposeless. But when you're in the midst of those, are you able to look to God and say, I don't understand, but I can still trust you? Because you are that sure and steady anchor we were singing about just a minute ago. On the other side of that, the positive side of that, so often God blesses us. So often God protects us. So often his provision is just so blatantly clear in our lives. And are we the ones who don't even pause to thank him for his providence in those situations? Are you watching for God's providence in your life? And are you acknowledging the fact that your life is far more than happen chance? It is not circumstantial. It is not good luck. It is God who is working in your life. Now, the book of Esther. In review, as we think about this, in the book of Esther, we've seen these things take place in chapter 1. This is very survey. We've been introduced to King Ahasuerus, a man full of himself who rules and reigns over the most powerful and mighty kingdom in the world at that time. He is the man, and he believes that he is the man, and he celebrates the fact that he is the man. He throws a 180-day celebration to celebrate himself. That's who this Ahasuerus is. This king is the greatest king, and he may be powerful and mighty in his time, but he is nothing before the King of Kings. He is nothing before the Lord of Lords. Ahasuerus may believe that the actions that he is taking are directing the course of his kingdom in the world that is known around him. But the fact is, it is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who turns the head of the king. And that is exactly what we see taking place in chapter 1. Also in chapter 1, we were introduced to King Vashti. We don't get to see very much of her. She's there and then she's gone. And then we see near the end of the celebration, which we described, that Ahasuerus throws for himself. He calls at the end of this time a drunken party loaded with excess and calls for the queen to be paraded before all the party participants. There's something that's inappropriate about this, though the details of it is not given exactly. But she refuses. I'm not going to do this. And based on her refusal, the fury of the king is ignited. And he removes her. He banishes her. She is no longer the queen, and she will never again be seen by the king. Been removed from her, if we could say it this way, her crown, but her throne in a sense. She has been removed. This is God's providence and sovereignty at work. Chapter 2. In chapter 2, we learn of two key central figures in this entire book, probably the central figures. We're looking at Mordecai and Esther. Esther and Mordecai are cousins, and yet it seems like there's a vast or a large age differentiation between them. We don't know how large, but Mordecai is probably quite a bit older than her. She is orphaned. They are exiled in the land of Persia, formerly of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And as she is orphaned, Mordecai, probably being her next of kin or her next closest family member, is brought into the situation where he essentially adopts her and raises her, brings her up as his daughter. The text literally tells us that, in his home. Now in Esther chapter 2, look at verse 7. Again, this seems so superficial, but this physical characteristic is drawn out and pointed toward and made very clear in regards to Esther. Midway through the section, or actually the text tells us her Hebrew name is Hadassah, Esther is her Persian name, and then midway through it tells us the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Now, a new queen is sought to fill the role that Queen Vashti had in this kingdom. But it's not just the fact that there's a vacancy. This is about the pleasure and satisfaction of the king. And so many young virgins who are considered to be beautiful enough, they meet the standard, are taken from their homes, from their families, from all the vast provinces of this kingdom, and they're brought into custody, into the harem of the king. They're prepared for one night with the king, and this preparation takes place over 1 year time, after 1 year's time. And as their designated night with the king has come, he will spend the night with each one of them individually to make the determination if she meets the bill, if he will call for her to come back. If she doesn't, in a sense, she goes into the second harem, but there's a sense she almost goes into banishment herself, in a sense. This is a terrible misuse and abuse of power by a despicable man. Think about what we're learning about image bearers of God. Treating these women not as image bearers of God, but treating them as things, as possessions, and lowering them to a state that they are simply there for his pleasure and his reputation. Esther is one of these young women. She is one of the young virgins who is selected. She is the one who is prepared. She spends her night with the queen. And to make the long story short, she now becomes the queen of Persia. She wears the crown. That's where we find ourselves in chapter 2. Now, last week, you were assigned homework. If you could take that out of your notebook and pass that to the center aisle, gentlemen are going to come and collect that. Nobody's moving. You were to read Esther chapter 2, verses 19 to 23. You were to look at that this past week. This is a small but significant portion of this entire narrative. It fits into what we're going to see in chapter 3, and it certainly is significant in the things that are going to come in future chapters as well. Mordecai, in this section, learns of a plot to overthrow, to kill the king. He reports this plot through Esther to the king. The two who are seeking to take over the kingdom, to overthrow Ahasuerus, are hanged in the gallows. From this civil perspective, justice has been brought because Mordecai took the actions necessary to point them out to the king. Significance. This noble deed on the part of Mordecai is recorded in the king's ledger, but no action is ever taken to reward Mordecai. It was written down, and then for whatever reason, it was either forgotten or bypassed, but nothing ever happens with this. That's important. It surfaces later on in this narrative, the things that are happening. But as we see what we're going to turn the page to chapter 3, I think there's a significance to the first events of chapter 3 that we're going to see here in just a second. And I want you to keep that placeholder. Mordecai does something very significant to take care of Ahasuerus through Esther. It's recorded in the ledger, in the journal, but nothing is done with that. He is not rewarded. He is not promoted. Nothing takes place. Now, one other thing that we're going to build a foundation with as we take one more step forward is the remembrance of the fact that it seems as though the book of Esther is a living example of God's providence and sovereignty in all of these unique events. And as we see this, we have continually been turning back to Romans 8:28 because this is regarding us. This is personal. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purposes. Not to what we purpose to be best, but to what his eternal purposes are. So, this book is loaded with God's providence, with his provision, with his sovereign rule. There is no coincidence. There are no chances that take place. There's no happenstance or good luck. And put yourselves in those shoes as well. God is in control of your life. You may never understand in this side of eternity what he's doing, but it doesn't change who he is. His providence and sovereignty are at work. Chapter 3. It's pretty straightforward, and yet there's horrible things that are going to take place in this chapter. We meet a new character, another very significant character. The name is Haman. And as we meet Haman, we are going to just simply say Haman is one bad dude. It was several weeks ago, I was out in my garage, and as I knew I was getting ready for Esther, I was listening to some different sermons from the book of Esther, just to kind of prepare my heart and mind of what we were going toward and to understand some things. And I was listening to a sermon by Mark Dever on this very section, and he challenged his congregation that whenever you hear the name Haman, you should respond with a boo. I'm not telling you need to do that. You can do with that as you please. But that's how bad, here's your chance, Haman really is. That's right. That's 100% stolen or plagiarized from Mark Dever. So we're going to look at this whole chapter, chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, in 2 outline points. We're just going to break it in half. And here are the 2 points. It's a little fuzzy. I'm not sure why that is. But the first bite, the fury of Haman burns against the Jews. That's verses 1 to 6. And then the second bite, we're going to see that the king is pleased with Haman's plan. That's verses 7 to 15. I think this kind of brings us to where we're going to see Mordecai, the cousin of Esther, in the situation he's in and the things that we might need to think about ourselves. There are occasions that we will very intentionally take steps to be obedient, to be faithful, to do what is right, and there are difficult outcomes that come out of that. And we stand back, and there's a part of us that cognitively in the brain, that kind of logically in that left brain side that says, I know as a follower of Christ, I'm called to do what Christ tells me to do, and there may be difficult circumstances that come out of that. I'm not necessarily going to be rewarded for that. You can probably think of circumstances of that in your own life, maybe ways that you've sought to be faithful to Christ or even just your employer in the workplace and nothing positives come out of that. Maybe it's about honestly representing finances in a W-2 form turned into the IRS and you get nailed in a way that you weren't expecting to. and the rest of the world fudges those numbers. Why am I getting nailed like this? Maybe you're a student and you think, you know what, I'm doing my best to be set apart in a secular classroom or institution, and the price I pay is it just seems like I have no friends at all. There's times we choose to do the things that we are intentionally saying, hey, I know this is what I should be doing. This is what God wants me to do. But it just seems like there's no reward that comes out of that. And here comes that difficulty where our brain says, I shouldn't expect that. But our heart says, I want that. This is what I desire. It seems like this isn't fair. What we have to recognize is in a great irony related to how chapter 2 closes in Mordecai's report about these two who are seeking to overthrow the kingdom. He and Esther, as they report this news to Ahasuerus, are never rewarded for it. Now bring us back to one more point before we take a step into the text itself. Remember last week I encouraged you to read this with empathy and attempt to read it as a first-time reader. I think almost everybody here, if not everybody here, knows the rest of the story. We know where this goes. But if you were reading this for the very first time, the way chapter 3 starts in relationship to the way chapter 2 ends, it doesn't work. Our anticipation of where this narrative should be going should say something like, and Mordecai is rewarded. But I'm going to foreshadow. I'm going to tell you where we're going. But instead, Haman, an Agagite, is rewarded. That's where we're going. Now, here's that first bite in our outline as we work through it again. The fury of Haman burns against the Jews. That's in verses 1 to 6. Let's read those verses right now, verses 1 to 6. After these things, quick commentary. What things? After the plot to overthrow Ahasuerus, and those two servants are dealt with, that there's justice that comes to them. So after these things, now what are you anticipating? Just think about it that way. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? When they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's word would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now, I'm not sure what this really has to do with the whole picture of what's going on in this book, but just something that's noteworthy. Do you see the level of backbiting and insubordination and factions that are in this kingdom, as one faction is seeking to overthrow another faction and tell stories on this one, and let's tell him that he's a Jew, and did you know he's not bowing down to you? This is happening all throughout the different tiers and levels of this kingdom. Again, the point of that, I don't know, but it's just a character representation of the way this nation is ruled. So now, based on how chapter 2 ends, here's that anticipation. Mordecai is going to be rewarded. He's going to be exalted. He's going to be the one who's placed in a higher position. It makes us want to go to Joseph and think about the situations that happens in that situation. It's not what happens in any way at all. In fact, when it comes to Mordecai, it is a dull thud. What does he get? Nothing. Yet. But what I want us to note is that this is so significant that God is using this in his providence and sovereignty. And even though nothing comes up for several more chapters, it will rise to the surface in chapter 6. And God is going to use it for his purposes at that time, but not here. So what we see here, what takes place instead of Mordecai, instead, the very next section in verse 1 says that King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite. So here's where we have to work on this. What is an Agagite? It is not a cool stone that you're going to find on the beach at McLean State Park. Okay? Someone else pointed out the fact it is not a fan of Texas A&M. Some of you got that one. Haman is a descendant of Agag. Okay? He's a descendant of Agag. Now, some of you might be working through your Old Testament knowledge, but I want you can pursue this or just process through this. When we see what Agag is he is the king of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15. I'm not projecting, I'm not reading all this because this is a whole different narrative section, but I'm trying to point you back to what's going on. The Amalekites are the ruthless enemies of Israel in a much earlier period of time for the Jews who were under the rule of King Saul. The prophet at that time is Samuel. Okay? So what we're going to see, and I hope you take my word for it, but you should search this out, be Bereans. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, in that section, Saul failed to obey the Lord. Saul failed to go forward and to take out or to kill King Agag. He didn't do what God desired him to do, which left the prophet Samuel responsible to do what this king would not do. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to project this, but this is a little bit of a PG-13 text, okay? For graphic and violence. I can't believe I just said that, but it's true. Then Samuel said, "Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully. Hear what's going on? If I could give you more information, or if you looked at the greater context, because Saul didn't treat him as he was supposed to be treated. Agag thinks this is a big joke. Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless." What is he saying? You know what you've done to our people? Childless. So shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Do you want me to describe that? So, Esther 3. Haman is a descendant of Agag. Now, here's what we have to grasp. It's one thing for us to note that Mordecai is unrewarded. But as a Jewish reader, reading this for the first time, empathizing with that perspective, there's something that is sucked out of your lungs as you're reading this, and Mordecai gets nothing. And who is promoted? Who is promoted to this place? An Agagite? A descendant of Agag instead of Mordecai? This Haman, according to verse 1, is advanced. He is set above all the officials who were with him, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. By the way, that means Haman wasn't worthy of homage. It meant that they were required to pay homage, because this is what the king said. Now, so to know the history and the background of 1 Samuel 15 and to now read this in Esther 3, this doesn't make sense. It does not calculate. It does not add up from the Jewish perspective. This promotion of Haman created a double problem for Mordecai. First, as we've already mentioned, Haman, because he's an Agagite, he hates the Jews. This is a deep, bitter dissension and rivalry that goes far beyond that. They hate each other. Secondly, Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. Mordecai says, "I will not bow." Now, here's one more of those times that this narrative text never tells us the motivation or the why Mordecai is unwilling to bow. It doesn't say he's unwilling to bow for this, that, or the other reason. Some speculate, is this an issue of pride? Does this go to that conflict that we referred to just a minute ago? And he's saying, "I'm not going to bow to one of those Amalekites." It's possible. That is possible. The text doesn't say that for us at all. I'm going to tell you my opinion without great authority. You can talk about this in your small group or at lunch today. It seems more probable to me that this unwillingness to bow is based something more in the root of God's law itself. It was the relationship to the commandment that we just looked at very recently in Sunday school. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, this is a man, but it seems like out of Mordecai's background, there's a relationship that he says, I can't bow a knee to this man. I will not bow a knee to this man. We also recognize that there seems to be a great correlation between the same exile that's taking place under Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians and three young men by the name of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I will not bow a knee to the golden idol, right? And there's a consequence. God spared in that case. We don't know this for a fact. It seems like it's probable or it's conceivable that that's the source of Mordecai's conviction. He's saying, I cannot bow a knee to this man. There's one other place that I think supports this within the text of Esther itself, and it's in chapter 3. Look at verse 8. Again, these are things we kind of string together, though the text doesn't clearly state this. But as Haman presents his case to the king in just a few verses, as we're going to get to this, one of the citations and one of the points that he brings, that he says, this is why we have to deal with these Jewish people. Midway through verse 8, he says, their laws are different from those of every other people. What laws? One thing, particularly in this biblical era, that set the Jewish people apart from all the other cultures that surrounded them is they are monotheistic. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. This is the foundation of their teaching. This is who God is. We don't worship multiple gods. We worship one God. And again, what seems to be taking place or is probable is Haman saying, and his conviction being unwilling to pay homage to me is because he's following those crazy laws of God and believes there is only one God. Seems like that's what's happening in this. So now go to verse 5, back into the section we're working through right now. Haman's not happy about this. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. By the way, I'm noticing more and more as I work through this book methodically, there's lots of fury in this book. You don't do what I want, I get fury. I'm infuriated. And the Agite within him is compelled to take vengeance, not only on the individual, but the entire Jewish community in the entire nation. He's seeking to bring genocide. Every Jew will be exterminated. The text says they will be annihilated. We're foreshadowing again where we're going to be going. In Haman's mind, he may be thinking that the gods have smiled on him in his promotion, and this is his opportunity to bring vengeance. This is his opportunity to be victorious over what took place with Samuel so many generations to his predecessor, Agag. But here's what we have to recognize. This isn't just a feud between the Jews and the Amalekites. This is a moment when God, by his providence and sovereignty, related even to the events that happened generations before, is working his perfect will. Did Samuel understand that when he hacked him to pieces? No. Does it change the fact that God is providentially working? No. This is all under his hand. So if it was only about one man, if it was only about Mordecai, it seems reasonable that the punishment of a single man, that he would just simply go to the gallows at that time, that would be appropriate. This is far deeper rooted. Mordecai ticks him off. Mordecai gives him the opportunity to kill all the Jews. This triggers in verse 4, the very last words. He's identified as a Jew, and it brings more information forward in verse 6. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He wants it all. So as they made it known to him, the people of Mordecai, you hear what's happening here? Here's more of that backbiting. Mordecai won't bow to you because he's a Jew. And you know what? There's Jews all over the place. They're just living in secret. Oh, really? Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. That's what's taking place here. This is complete and total genocide of the entire Jewish population because one man would not bow. His fury runs deep into his bones, but God is in control. God is even using the twisted, perverted heart of one who seeks to overthrow the Jewish people for what took place to his many descendants for grandfather times how many numbers, I don't even know the answer, King Agag. This is his opportunity to take vengeance. But God is in control of that. God uses this firm conviction of Mordecai not to bow to spark a plot to kill all the Jews. God uses a generation-old feud between the Jewish people and the Amalekites from Haman to accomplish his eternal plans. God uses a new queen to bring salvation to the Jews. God will use the most complex of circumstances in your life right now in order to accomplish his perfect will. And there may be a moment on this side of eternity you get glimpses of that. But I think we're all going to enter eternity and look to the other side of what God has woven and say, I see the picture. I see what you have done here. I didn't understand it there, but I see it now. We must remind ourselves, even as we work forward now, of Romans 8:28. For those who are called according to his purposes. Not the things we understand or the whys or what we want, but it's what God purposes for our lives. Second bite. The king is pleased with the plan. So we start into this. Let's look at verses 7 down through 11, and we'll just read this section. We'll make some comments, and we'll move forward. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur. That is, they cast lots. Before Haman, day after day, they cast it, month after month, till the 12th month, which was the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. Just such a simple answer, let's just wipe them out. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Haggite, the son of, I'm probably going to say it different this time than I did the last time, Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Now verse 7. Verse 7 is a detailed account of dates and times that as we read it, I don't know if you can relate to this, my brain doesn't exactly go to the place to say, when is that? What month is that? My brain kind of scans back that and just doesn't process that because those months don't mean a lot to us. So what I'm going to tell you is we're going to rely on some other scholars to help us figure that out. But those dates and months are significant, very significant into the greater narrative of this story. But let me show you one other thing. This is interesting. We read this story as if it's happening just over the course of months and weeks and maybe a year or so. This is taking place over many years. Do you remember when we looked at chapter 1, verse 1, we noted that celebration was in the third year of the king's reign. In chapter 2, verse 16, we noted it was the 7th year of the king's reign. Now we're here in chapter 3, verse 7. What year is it? It's the 12th year of his reign. So lots and lots of time are elapsing. Lots of time has passed in this, and we have to recognize that's what's going on. The other thing we see here are the notation of these months. Nisan and Adar. These mean very little to the majority of us. I already alluded to this I read those, and I have to look to charts and try and understand what those are and what months they are in relationship to the calendar. It's not something that I can just rattle off the top of my head. But these, to the original readers, to the Jewish people, when they read this, these months were clear and important months and facts to them. They meant something to them. Let's just take this into a contemporary writing, and maybe we were to look at something that talked about something, 20 years ago. And as it was talking about an event that took place 20 years ago, and you were reading it, and it referred to the later season of December. We would read that, and we would say, oh, that's the 12th month of the year. But we would hear the later portion of December, and our brain would immediately at least go to the place that would say, oh, it's somewhat time around Christmas time. That's around that season. These kinds of months that are noted here to the Jewish people would have been that significant. They would have gotten it. They would have understood it. And I'm going to explain it more in just a few minutes as we get further ahead. They heard these months, the way it was spelled out. They were able to work through it pretty quickly and go, oh, that's when that happened. Very interesting. Now, the other thing we're going to see is in verse 7, we talk about Haman, and he does this thing of casting lots of and what we see is this is how he was determining the right time to kill the Jews. When we look at that, we don't understand exactly or precisely what's going on there. It sounds almost like they cast lots every single day for an entire year, but it's probably something different than that. They sat down and cast lots for every day, and then for every week, and then for every month, and then they did this representatively over the entire year, and they used this process in one time that they cast all these lots to determine which day on the calendar is the right day to execute all the Jews. Something like that's probably what's going on. Now, when we hear this word per, it means nothing to us. That's why in parenthesis we get this transliteration. To per means that you're casting lots. And casting of lots is still something that's foreign to us, and probably what's most familiar to us and might even resemble it is rolling dice. That's what these guys are doing, something like that. It's a random chance casting of something that would come out and roll in a certain way, a stone, a shape with different signals or symbols or numbers on it that indicated different things. They are looking to the small g gods to work by their providence and sovereignty to bring justice upon the Jews. Do I need to spell this out to us? The gods mean nothing before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But they're looking to them through this to determine when is the right season. Here's something else that's beautiful. This is going to come out at the end of the book, but we're going to let it out of the bag even now. To cast per is to recognize one of the celebrations or the feasts of the Jewish people that is one of the last feasts that's established in their calendar is Purim. The feast or the festival of Purim. Because on that day, Purim celebrates God's people who were saved through the courage and the work of Queen Esther. And by the way, when I did some superficial reading on this, describing what Purim is, I didn't see anything that said, "and the providence and sovereignty of God's hand," in a sad notation. Haman essentially cast these dice to determine the very significant date of when an entire nation of people will be exterminated. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33. It says, the lot, casting of lots, the lot is cast into the lap, but its very decision is from the Lord. Can we just remind ourselves again that God's providence and sovereignty is working in the most insignificant of matters? We think of the casting of a lot being absolutely just a matter of chance. In matters like this, God is sovereign. God is working. He's working in the finest of details in the story, even in the insignificance of a number or a mark or the way that a stone flopped or rolled before them to mark the day and the time in which these events will take place. Here's what I want us to say one more time, one more way. Haman and the men who cast these lots, the stones, the small g gods, have nothing to do with when this event will take place. This is God's prescribed date when these things are to take place. And that's so important. By God's sovereign hand, the date for this massacre would be the 12th month. Not the next month. Not the second month, the third month. The 12th month, 1 year away. Okay? Verse 8. Haman then proposes his plot to the king. Haman's pitch is relatively easy, yet it veils the fine print. He talks about what's going to take place, and it's quickly accepted by the evil heart of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is quick to see the merits of the plan. But again, Haman only gives the details that are going to be pleasing to the ear and the eye of Ahasuerus. He doesn't give any details about Mordecai being the cousin of the queen. He doesn't give any details of any of those kinds of matters at all. He simply talks about the fact that this is an opportunity to wipe out a group of people that are going to be very prosperous. There's going to be a great amount of money that's going to come into the kingdom as a result of this. And Ahasuerus essentially says, here's my ring. Make it so, Scotty. Get it done. Make sure this happens. In a sense, Ahasuerus didn't read the fine print at the bottom of the contract because Haman veiled it. He only gave him the information that he wanted. Then we go down to verse 9. And the promise of silver only sweetened the deal. It only made it a better deal in the mind of Ahasuerus. Verse 10 and 11, so the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Get it done. Make it happen. Verses 12 down to verse 15, the close of the chapter. This is what it says. This is the implementation of the plan. This is how it goes forth. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the people, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. By the way, who did that? Haman's, right? He's got the signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by the order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. Boy, it just brings us back to that celebration in chapter 1, doesn't it? How do you celebrate a travesty? Let's just drink some more. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. The entire nation, every province, the furthest reaching aspects of this Persian Empire was to be notified. And the instruction was to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate, verse 13, all the Jews, young and old, women and children in one day. Hear this out. What is this text saying? It's total annihilation without mercy. I don't care how old they are. I don't care how big they are. I don't care if they're a man, if they're a woman. I don't care. You kill them all. Every last one of them. Now, friend and foe alike, this is, I think, the confusion that takes place in Susa and throughout the kingdom. We're fully aware of what would happen and take place 1 year from that notification. Verse 15 says that the city was thrown into confusion. And as the city is in confusion, as the people are sitting down, just think of a major bill or some kind of major decision that might be made in our government and how it throws turmoil, and people talk about it and division among people, even within the church, how that takes place. The people of Susa are like, what is this? These Jews are here. We're going to kill those people. We get their money. And then there's the Jews. What? They're going to kill us all in a year? Our children? Every one of us? Our old, our young, our wives, all of us? You want some empathy? Just think about this. This is a travesty. This is a horrible edict that goes out saying, we're going to kill them all. And for 1 year, for 12 months, you go to bed with your family at night, knowing that a year from now, they're going to kill them all. Just think about that. Think about the fact of just empathy. Think about where you are now, maybe the anxiety that you have for your own children. What does their future look like? Your grandchildren, what does their future look like? Maybe when you send them out to do different things in the community or experience something new and you're worried about their safety, their protection, first time they drive, that kind of anxiety, those things that stir up that naturally happen as parents. How would you like to put your kids to bed at night knowing that in a year the government's going to annihilate them? And no one will be spared. And then in 11 months, and then in 10 months, 9, 8. Just think of the anxiety, the struggle that would weigh upon you. God is still sovereign. God has a purpose even in this horrible edict. We know how this story is going to end. We know where Paul Harvey is going to take us to the rest of the story when we read the rest of this book, right? As this is happening in real time, as these edicts are going out, as they are being announced in all of these communities, as these families are going to bed at night, they don't have a clue. They don't know how the story ends. They don't know at all. This is horrible. And yet, we recognize that the end of the story brings us to the celebration of Purim. It's where we're headed. Ahasuerus might be king, and Haman might be in control of the kingdom, but God is sovereign. Ahasuerus might sign them off with his signet ring, but the lives of the Jews are not for him to give away or to take away. It is God who is sovereign. In conclusion, we've made allusions to the significance of the dates and times and the months that are mentioned all throughout here, and most of us, again, read it and we go, what is that? This doesn't mean anything to me at all. To the people who are reading this for the first time, they know. They understand. I'm going to lean on a paragraph from Landon Dowden, one of the commentaries that's been helping me study through this, as he just touches on this, as we're going to flesh this out further as we work into the book. Landon says this: the news of this death decree was sent out just, here's the dates, as the Jewish people were preparing for the Passover. You recall the Passover, right? He says. It's the remembrance and celebration for when God delivered his people from the hands of his enemies, the Egyptians. So on the day God's people were celebrating his deliverance, they learned that their deaths had been decreed in Persia. God will once again show his faithfulness to deliver his people in his time, in his way, and in his place, under his perfect providence and sovereignty. Guys, God's providence and sovereignty, they're active in your lives today. You don't know what tomorrow brings. The events that are happening in your place right now that are causing you to be anxious, God's in control of that. And he will work all things together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose.